آقای وینستون چرچیل که اسمشون رو حتما خیلی شنیدید و ایشون تقریبا میتونم بگم حالا نفر اول سیاست تو دنیا نامیده میشدن، در سال 1901 وارد پارلمان بریتانیا یا همون انگلیس شدن. ایشون پسر لرد راندولف چرچیل بودن و با استفاده از نفوذی که پدرشون داشتن، یعنی آقای راندولف، تونستن وارد پارلمان بشن در سال 1901. خب سنشون 26 سال بود و در سن 26 سالگی این موضوع خیلی اهمیت داشت که فردی جوان وارد پارلمان کهنسال و کهنپرست بریتانیا بشه. هول و هوش 7-8 سال 9 سال طول کشید تا ایشون تونستن جایگاه بسیار خوبی رو با توجه به تفکراتشون و ادبیاتشون در مورد سیاست توی پارلمان کسب بکنن. یه نکته بگم جالبه که ایشون انقدر عاشق سیاست بودن که حتی تو روز عروسیشون تمام و کمال فقط در مورد سیاست صحبت میکردن. طی این 9 سال ایشون با موفقیت هایی که کسب کردن تونستن در سال 1910 وزیر داخله بریتانیا بشن و این سمت بسیار بزرگی بود برای ایشون لابی های بسیار زیادی میکردن تا بتونن مقابله بکنن با وزیر بازنشسته قبلی که تمام و کمال ایشون تفکرشون این بود که همه درآمد نفت رو اختصاص بدن به ساخت و ساز و ساخت‌های زیربنایی کشور بریتانیا. ولی ایشون آقای چرچیل باشون مخالف بودن و میگفتن که باید نیروی دریایی بریتانیا بشه قوی ترین و بزرگترین نیروی دریایی دنیا. به خاطر همین تلاش ها و همین کوشش ها بود که ایشون رو بهشون لقب Godfather of Oil اختصاص دادن و خب تلاششون این بود که مدرن سازی بکنن، بهینه بکنن، وسعت بدن و بتونن ازش بهره برداری بکنن برای بخش‌های دریایی و نظامی کشور خودشون. در سال 1911 آقای وینستون چرچیل تقاضای یک جلسه‌ای رو دادن با نخست وزیر بریتانیا. در سال 1911 دقیقاً زمانی که آقای وینستون چرچیل درخواست دادن که یک ملاقات داشته باشن با نخست وزیر کشور بریتانیا، طی اون ملاقات آقای اسکوات نخست وزیر بریتانیا یک پیشنهاد کاملا غیر منتظره به آقای چرچیل داد. ایشون پیشنهاد کردن که آقای وینستون چرچیل بشن دریادار یا وزیر دریایی کشور بریتانیا و این بسیار برای ایشون اتفاق جذاب و شگفت‌انگیزی بود، چون تمام تلاشش بر این بود که نیروی دریایی بریتانیا رو بکنه سریع‌ترین، قوی‌ترین و پرقدرت‌ترین نیروی دنیا. ایشون تونستن توی شروع این برنامه تقریباً 3 ساله اولش 54 تا ناوشکن و 74 تا زیردریایی رو برای ناوگان دریایی بریتانیا تولید بکنن و واقعاً توی اون زمان توی 3 سال خیلی اتفاق بزرگی بود. بعد از کسب تمام موفقیت‌ها ایشون هر روز در حال گسترش محبوبیتشون بودن و بسیار فرد کاردرست و سیاستمداری توی اون زمان نامگذاری شده بودن، یعنی اونطوری بهشون لقب میدادن. حالا از جمله سخت شد. توی همون زمان بود که در سال 1914 جون 1914 اومدن به مجلس اعوام بریتانیا یک پیشنهاد خیلی بزرگ دادن. ایشون پیشنهاد دادن که 2.2 میلیون پوند سرمایه گذاری بکنن برای ارتقا و گسترش نیروی دریایی بریتانیا و در ازاش 51% سهام نفت شرکت ایران و انگلیس رو دریافت بکنن. و پیشنهاد دومشون هم این بود که 2 نفر در هیئت مدیره همین مجموعه قرار بگیره که فقط و فقط حق اینو داشته باشه که به نفع نیروی دریایی بریتانیا وتو بکنه. حالا توی همین شرایط بود که تقریباً 2-3 ماه بعدش این قرارداد 20 ساله جذاب بزرگ بسته شد و پیشنهاد آقای چرچیل پذیرفته شد. تا اینجای کار رو شنیدید و متوجه شدید که نفت چه تأثیری و چه جریانی حتی توی نیروی نظامی دنیا داشت و اینکه چه افرادی تأثیرات بسیار شگرفی رو توی این مسیر داشتن. حالا میخوام بهتون بگم تو جلسه بعد قراره از همون قصه تلخه، یعنی جنگ جهانی، صحبت بشه. قسمت بعد رو از دست ندید تا براتون روایت و داستان جنگ جهانی رو بگم که چقدر هم به ایران سخت گذشت اون شرایط و اینکه اون نفتی که طلای سیاهه، یا ما تو این برنامه هم صداش کردیم برکت یا بلاست، وضعیتش تو این جنگ مشخص بشه و ببینیم به چه سمتی جریان جنگ رو پیش میبره.
Early 1930s, Churchill also began sounding the alarm concerning the rise to power of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in the first weeks of 1933, and the Nazis quickly turned the country into a one-party state. As early as April 1933, Churchill gave a speech in the British House of Commons in which he spoke about what he called the odious conditions in Germany. As the months went by and the Nazis began rearming Germany in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, Churchill lambasted government policy which was failing to recognize the threat posed by a revitalized German military. He was especially critical of the failure to create a new, modern, well-appointed British Air Force and the rapidity with which the German Luftwaffe overtook the British RAF from 1935 onwards. Yet, Churchill's warning calls were ignored in some circles, in part because he had lost credibility amongst a significant number of MPs, owing to his virulent objections to Indian self-government and the manner in which he had launched scathing attacks against Gandhi's character. Perhaps, many wondered, Churchill's critique of Hitler and the Nazis was similarly misinformed. Churchill would continue to warn the British political establishment of the dangers of the Nazis into the mid-1930s and beyond. Despite this, many failed to see the danger. This should perhaps be seen in context. The 1930s was a time of extremist politics. Italy had been controlled by Benito Mussolini and his fascists since the early 1920s, and a vicious civil war would soon grip Spain. For many within the political sphere in Britain, Hitler and the Nazis were not viewed as the primary threat within this political landscape. Rather, the greater threat seemed to be posed by the Soviet Union and its authoritarian leader, Joseph Stalin. The fear was that if Moscow-aligned communist movements emerged and seized power in a number of Central and Western European nations, then Russia would soon be in a position to dominate the continent. Viewed from this perspective, the Nazis were the lesser of two evils and certainly a bulwark against the rise of radical socialism. Indeed, in 1936, Churchill's old ally in government during the First World War, David Lloyd George, visited Germany, met Hitler, and reported back enthusiastically on what the Germans were doing to rebuild their country following the shock of the Great Depression. It was for these reasons that many people either did not see the threat posed by the Nazis in the same way which Churchill did in the 1930s, or else refused to see it. This was not for the want of trying on the former Chancellor of the Exchequer's part. In an effort to bring greater awareness to the issue, he even aligned himself in the mid-1930s with the Anti-Nazi Council, a British political organisation which had arisen out of the left-wing movement in England. In order to work alongside them, Churchill toned down his opposition to the Soviet Union. Within the council, a focus group consisting of virulent opponents of the Nazis and the British Manifestation of Fascism, Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, emerged, which included figures such as Austen Chamberlain, the half-brother of Neville Chamberlain, who succeeded Stanley Baldwin as leader of the Conservatives and became Prime Minister in 1937, and other Conservative politicians such as Robert Boothby and Henry Page Croft. Collectively, they organized rallies and meetings which sought to draw attention to the risks of appeasing Germany, while it also worked with members of the civil service and intelligence services to produce concrete evidence of how extensive the German rearmament program was. Despite these efforts in the mid-1930s, the message of Churchill and his allies seemed to be falling on completely deaf ears. There were distractions within British politics, not the least of which was the crisis which followed from the accession of King Edward VIII as the new monarch in January 1936. Edward was determined to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee who was unacceptable to British social norms by the standards of the 1930s. A constitutional crisis followed, one which was only resolved at the end of that year when Edward abdicated in favour of his younger brother, who became King George VI. The upshot of the abdication crisis was that the issue of German rearmament and the increasingly jingoistic attitude of Hitler and the Nazis towards their neighbours were largely shelved throughout 1936. Moreover, unbeknownst to the political establishment, a further setback occurred in the early summer of 1937 when Stanley Baldwin retired from political life and was succeeded as Prime Minister by Neville Chamberlain. Over the next year and a half, Chamberlain would oversee what, in retrospect, might be viewed as one of the most profoundly misinformed policies of appeasement in human history. Churchill would be his most vocal critic throughout. At the heart of the matter in the late 1930s was the increasing speed with which Nazi Germany was seeking to realize its ambitions. The goal of Hitler and the Nazis had always been to strengthen Germany's economy, rearm the nation, and begin a new pan-European war in which they would have revenge for the humiliation that had been imposed on the German people at the end of the First World War. Initially, Hitler and his accomplices had believed they would need to wait until 1941 or 1942 before initiating such a conflict, but by 1938, faced with the seeming indifference of the British and French political establishments to their rearmament, Hitler decided to speed the process up. Thus, in March 1938, diplomatic and military pressure was poured on Austria to force the country into accepting a political union with Germany. When a Greater Germany was declared and Nazi flags started flying in Vienna, Churchill made a speech before the House of Commons in England in which he declared that the gravity of the situation could not be underestimated. Still, few people were willing to accept his warnings at face value. Once Austria was annexed, Hitler immediately began demanding to take control of the Sudetenland, an extensive part of western Czechoslovakia, which had a primarily ethnically German population. By the autumn of 1938, the German military was mobilizing to invade Czechoslovakia if the European powers did not give in to Germany's demands. Churchill was adamant that Britain could not allow this to stand, and indeed he visited Neville Chamberlain at number 10 Downing Street, the official residence of the British Prime Minister, to put on record his belief that Britain should declare war on Germany if the Nazis violated Czechoslovak sovereignty. At least a hard line needed to be taken in negotiations with Hitler. But Chamberlain did not heed his advice. Instead, just a few days later, he flew to Munich in southern Germany for a conference with Hitler and the other major heads of state. There, on the 30th of September 1938, Chamberlain signed up to the Munich Agreement, a diplomatic arrangement which gifted the Sudetenland to the Nazis in return for a promise that no further land claims would be made by Berlin. Back at home, Churchill was appalled as the policy of appeasement reached its peak. He described Munich a total and unmitigated defeat. Events soon proved Churchill right and Chamberlain wrong. In March 1939, Hitler and the Nazis breached the terms of the Munich Agreement when they dismembered the rest of Czechoslovakia, annexing portions of it and creating a vassal state out of what remained. Within days, Berlin was making it clear that Poland was its next target. With it now seemingly inevitable that war was to follow before long, Britain and France belatedly accelerated their rearmament programs. Meanwhile, back in England, Churchill's political popularity was growing anew as MPs and the general public came to appreciate that he had been right all along in the warnings he had made since 1933 about the Nazis. There was, consequently, a growing swell of support for Churchill to be brought into the government by Chamberlain. Eventually, Chamberlain consented, but not before the Second World War commenced. The outbreak of the conflict was triggered by Germany's invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany in response. That same day, Chamberlain appointed Churchill as the new First Lord of the Admiralty, the position he had held a quarter of a century earlier and ignominiously vacated after the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. It was the beginning of his rapid ascent to Britain's wartime leader. Churchill would oversee the Royal Navy for the first 8 months of the war. This period is often known as the Phony War, as there was only limited military activity on the Western Front. Germany quickly overran and occupied Poland in September and October 1939, but thereafter the war settled into a period of inertia as neither side made any major strategic moves in the winter of 1939. Unsure of how to proceed, British thoughts turned to the strategic position of Norway, which controlled a huge amount of the coastal region of northern Europe and the North Atlantic. The country was neutral, but many suspected that Hitler and the Nazis would move in the spring to occupy Norway and perhaps Sweden also as a means of gaining control of a number of North Atlantic seaports and securing the huge iron ore deposits of Sweden, which, in the long run, would be crucial to the German war effort. Accordingly, throughout the winter of 1939 and spring of 1940, Churchill and the Admiralty Office were working out strategic plans to either lay down sea mines along the Norwegian coastline or to even occupy a number of key Norwegian ports such as Narvik. Measures were being implemented to realize these plans in the spring of 1940 when the Nazis suddenly ended the relative calm by invading Denmark and taking control of Norway through special operations in which thousands of German paratroopers were airlifted into Norway's main cities and ports. In response to the German occupation of Norway, a combined British, French, Free Polish and Free Norwegian expeditionary force was dispatched to the North Atlantic in April 1940. It made limited progress, and it was this state of affairs which opened up the infamous Norway debate in the British House of Commons on the 7th of May. The ostensible purpose of the motions under debate was the handling of this campaign, but it quickly evolved into a discussion of the general handling of the war by Neville Chamberlain and his government. In the course of 3 days of debates, it became clear that Chamberlain not only did not have the support of the Labour Party and the Liberals, but had lost the support of a substantial proportion of the Conservative Party. A previous wartime leader, David Lloyd George, provided a particularly damning account of affairs in which he stated that preparations for the Army, Navy and Air Force had all been inadequate, during the course of which Churchill intervened to say whatever deficiencies there were in the Royal Navy were his rather than Chamberlain's fault. It was a clear sign that Churchill, unlike Chamberlain, was willing to take responsibility for his actions and the handling of affairs. When Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister following the end of the debate on the 9th of May, Churchill was quickly voted in as the new Prime Minister on the 10th of May. He later stated that he believed that his whole life up to this point had been, quote, a preparation for this hour and for this trial.